They say it like it's obvious, like it's polite advice, like it's helpful. Just budget better. As if the problem was that you never thought to write numbers down. As if you've been reckless, impulsive, irresponsible. As if no one ever told you to track your spending, cut lattes, cancel subscriptions, or be more disciplined. The phrase sounds harmless, but what it really says is this: if you're struggling, it's your fault. And that lie has been repeated so often that most people don't even question it anymore. You feel it every time prices go up and someone shrugs, every time rent jumps and the advice is downsize, every time groceries cost more and the answer is plan meals better, every time you're exhausted, working more than you ever have, and still falling behind, and the solution offered is a spreadsheet. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Budgeting didn't stop working. It was never designed to fix what you're facing now. Because budgeting assumes something that no longer exists, a stable system. It assumes that if you plan carefully enough, the numbers will cooperate, that income will rise roughly alongside costs, that emergencies are occasional, not constant, that rent, healthcare, insurance, education, and basic survival will stay within predictable ranges. That assumption used to be mostly true. It isn't anymore. Today you can budget perfectly and still lose. You can cut everything non-essential and still watch the gap widen. You can track every dollar and still feel like your money is evaporating. And when that happens, the system doesn't question itself. It questions you. Maybe you didn't optimize enough. Maybe you weren't disciplined. Maybe you made one wrong decision 5 years ago, and now you're paying for it. That's the psychological trap. Because once you accept that framing, you stop asking harder questions. You stop noticing what's actually changed. You stop seeing the structure you're inside. Budgeting is a tool, but it's a tool for distribution, not creation. It helps you decide how to divide what you already have. It does nothing to change how much comes in, and it does nothing to slow how fast everything around you gets more expensive. When costs rise faster than income, budgeting becomes an illusion of control. It feels productive. It feels responsible. It feels like you're doing something, but all you're really doing is choosing which pressure point hurts the least. You're not bad with money. You're in an environment where money has less power every year. Think about how budgeting advice is usually framed. Cut wants, not needs. But what happens when almost everything becomes a need? Housing isn't optional. Healthcare isn't optional. Transportation isn't optional. Internet isn't optional. Insurance isn't optional. Education isn't optional if you want access to work that pays slightly better than survival. So the cuts move inward. You cut rest, you cut margin, you cut resilience, you delay medical care, you postpone maintenance, you ignore small problems until they become expensive emergencies, and then you're told you should have planned better. Budgeting culture never talks about that part. It doesn't talk about how people are being forced to budget risk, not spending. It doesn't talk about how the modern budget is mostly about absorbing shocks. It doesn't talk about how one surprise expense can erase months of careful planning. Because if it did, the lie would fall apart. The lie depends on one idea staying intact, that the system is fair and the outcomes reflect effort. But look around. People are working more hours than they used to. They're more productive than ever. They're better educated. They're more efficient. And yet they're saving less, owning less, stressing more, and feeling constantly behind. That's not a budgeting problem. That's a structural one. When wages lag and prices accelerate, budgeting becomes a coping mechanism, not a solution, a way to survive emotionally inside a system that keeps demanding more while giving less. And here's the part that really matters. The reason just budget better makes people angry isn't because budgeting is useless. It's because the advice erases reality. It tells people to fix themselves instead of questioning the environment. It turns systemic pressure into personal failure. It keeps the focus small, quiet, and individual, where it's safe. Safe for the system, not for you. Because if people stopped blaming themselves, they might start asking different questions. They might ask why full-time work no longer guarantees stability, why essential costs rise regardless of productivity, why debt has become a requirement instead of a tool, why doing everything right no longer leads to security. And once those questions start, just budget better stops working as a silencing phrase. That's why it's repeated so aggressively. That's why it's everywhere. That's why it feels moralized. It's not advice, it's containment. And the more you struggle, the more tightly it's applied. Here's what almost no one tells you about being good with money. When you're constantly budgeting, you're not building wealth, you're managing decline. That sounds harsh, but look at what most modern budgets actually do. They don't help people get ahead. They help people slow down how fast they fall behind. You're not planning for growth, you're planning for damage control. The modern budget isn't about freedom, it's about containment. You're deciding which bill gets paid first, which subscription gets cut, which repair gets postponed, which part of life gets smaller this month. That's not strategy, that's triage. And the cruel irony is that the better you get at it, the longer you can survive without anything fundamentally changing. Which is exactly why the advice persists. Because budgeting keeps people functional inside a broken structure. It keeps the lights on just enough to prevent collapse. It absorbs shock quietly. And systems love that. There's another uncomfortable truth hidden inside the just budget better mindset. It trains people to think small. When every decision is framed around cutting, you stop imagining expansion. You stop thinking in terms of leverage, opportunity, or long-term positioning. Your entire mental world shrinks down to short-term survival. You become incredibly disciplined, but in the wrong direction. You get good at saying no to yourself, good at suppressing wants, good at lowering expectations, good at adapting downward. And none of that makes you safer in a system where costs keep climbing. In fact, it often makes you more vulnerable. Because when you cut too close to the bone, you remove your own buffer. You lose flexibility. You lose optionality. You lose the ability to take risks that could actually improve your situation. You can't change jobs easily because you can't miss a paycheck. You can't invest in learning because every dollar is accounted for. You can't relocate, pivot, or pause because there's no slack left. Budgeting teaches you to survive, not to move. And then people wonder why they feel stuck. There's also a psychological cost that rarely gets discussed. Constant budgeting creates a permanent sense of scarcity, even when numbers technically balance. You start measuring your worth in restraint. You feel guilt for spending, even on necessities. Every purchase becomes a moral decision. You're not just managing money, you're managing shame. And that shame is incredibly effective at keeping people compliant, because shame turns structural failure into personal anxiety. Instead of asking, "Why is this so hard?" you ask, "What did I do wrong?" Instead of noticing that housing eats half your income, you blame yourself for not finding a better deal. Instead of noticing that healthcare is unpredictable and expensive by design, you blame yourself for not having a bigger emergency fund. Instead of noticing that wages have stalled while productivity soared, you blame yourself for not hustling enough. The lie works because it keeps the pressure internal. And here's where it gets even darker. Budgeting advice is often given by people who are no longer constrained by it. People who benefited from cheaper housing, from stable pensions, from affordable education, from decades where income growth roughly matched cost growth. They speak from a different economic climate, but present their experience as timeless truth. So when it doesn't work for you, the conclusion isn't the conditions changed. The conclusion is you failed. That disconnect creates isolation. People stop talking honestly about money, they hide stress, they internalize panic, they assume everyone else has it figured out, which makes the system look more functional than it actually is. But if you zoom out, a pattern becomes obvious. More people budgeting than ever, more financial content than ever, more tracking tools, apps, spreadsheets, and optimization advice than ever. And yet, less security, less ownership, less confidence in the future. If budgeting was the solution, this wouldn't be happening. The problem isn't that budgeting is useless. It's that budgeting has been sold as a cure for problems it cannot solve. It cannot fix wage stagnation. It cannot counter inflation. It cannot make housing affordable. It cannot remove systemic risk. It cannot turn instability into stability. All it can do is help you decide how to absorb the impact. And absorbing impact quietly is not the same as winning. That's why the advice feels insulting to so many people now. Because deep down, they know the math isn't the issue. They know they didn't suddenly forget how to add. They know they're not careless children who need discipline. They know something bigger is pushing back. And being told to just budget better feels like being gaslit by politeness. It sounds calm. It sounds reasonable. But it ignores lived reality. And people feel that disconnect in their bodies before they can explain it in words. The reason just budget better refuses to die isn't because it works. It's because it's convenient. It's simple. It's non-threatening. It doesn't challenge power, policy, or structure. It places responsibility neatly on the individual and walks away. From the system's point of view, it's perfect, because as long as people believe their financial stress is a personal failure, they won't ask harder questions. They won't demand different rules. They won't connect their experience to everyone else's. They'll just keep optimizing themselves inside a shrinking box. And there's something else hidden in this advice that rarely gets acknowledged. Budgeting creates the illusion of control. When everything feels unstable, having a spreadsheet feels grounding. It feels like action. It feels responsible. But control over pennies does not equal control over outcomes. You can track every dollar perfectly and still lose to rent hikes, to layoffs, to medical bills, to market shifts you never touched. So people do what humans always do under pressure. They double down. They budget harder. They restrict more. They judge themselves more harshly. They assume the pain means the system is working and they just need to endure. That mindset keeps people locked in effort without leverage. And leverage is the real dividing line. Not discipline, not willpower, not sacrifice. Leverage, who has it, who doesn't, and who is told they should survive without it. Most people aren't broke because they spend too much. They're broke because they have no bargaining power, they don't control pricing, they don't control risk distribution, they don't control time in a meaningful way. Budgeting doesn't change any of that, which is why the people who actually escape precarity usually stop obsessing over budgets at some point, not because they become reckless, but because they shift focus. From restriction to positioning, from tracking to leverage, from cutting to increasing optionality. They ask different questions. Not, how do I spend less, but how do I reduce exposure to unpredictable costs? Not, how do I save harder, but how do I make income less fragile? Not, how do I optimize this month, but what makes me less replaceable next year? Those questions are uncomfortable because they point outward instead of inward. They imply that the problem isn't character, it's architecture. And once you see that, the shame starts to crack. You stop feeling stupid for struggling. You stop treating exhaustion as a moral failure. You stop assuming everyone else has a secret you missed. You realize you were following advice designed for a world that no longer exists. That doesn't mean budgeting is evil. It means it's incomplete. A tool sold as a philosophy, a tactic sold as a solution, a coping mechanism sold as virtue. And when people reject just budget better, they're not rejecting responsibility. They're rejecting a lie that no longer fits their lives. They're asking, quietly at first, for honesty instead of slogans. Because deep down, most people already know this. If budgeting were enough, they wouldn't feel this tired. If budgeting were enough, they wouldn't feel this anxious. If budgeting were enough, they wouldn't feel like they're running in place while everything gets more expensive. The frustration isn't immaturity, it's awareness. And awareness is the first thing systems try to talk you out of.